Southampton, late May 1945. An American assessment officer steps off a jeep at the edge of a vehicle park that has no visible end. Row after row of olive-drab lorries stretch toward the horizon, their paint already fading under the English sun, their Detroit-built bodies, the rounded bonnets of Chevrolet, the flat grills of Ford, the sturdy frames of GMC and Studebaker, sitting in formations more disciplined than most of the armies that once drove them. He is here with a clipboard and a mandate from the Foreign Liquidation Commission, and his instructions are simple, almost brutally so: count them, grade them, and inform the British government that ownership was never transferred. Britain has driven these trucks from North Africa to the Rhine. It has maintained them, worn them out, and depended on them absolutely. But it does not own a single one. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, the question hanging over nearly 500,000 American vehicles scattered across Britain and the continent is not sentimental. It is financial, and it is unforgiving. Pay or give them back. This is not where the war ends. It is where the bill arrives. The scale of the problem becomes clear almost immediately. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped 427,284 trucks and lorries to Britain alone, with a further 52,000 sent to British Empire forces elsewhere. By May 1945, American vehicles make up roughly 60% of Britain's entire military lorry fleet. The Eighth Army in Italy depends on them almost entirely. The British Second Army in Germany runs American vehicles over British models at a ratio of 3-to-1. Spread across the map, the fleet forms a vast logistical constellation. 180,000 lorries sit in vehicle parks across Britain itself. Another 120,000 occupy depots scattered through France, Belgium and Germany. 85,000 remain in the Mediterranean theatre, and the rest are dispersed from Egypt to Burma. This is the largest single foreign-owned vehicle fleet ever assembled on foreign soil, and every one of these trucks belongs on paper to a government 8,000 kilometers away. The roots of the problem trace back before the war even reached its final year. In November 1940, as Britain's finances buckled under the weight of the fight against Germany, its ambassador to Washington, Lord Lothian, stepped off a plane at LaGuardia Airport and told the assembled press, in words that would circulate through American newsrooms for weeks, that Britain was broke and it was America's money they wanted. That blunt admission had opened the door to Lend-Lease itself. 5 years later, the same underlying arithmetic, an exhausted economy unable to pay cash for what it desperately needed, resurfaces around 500,000 trucks parked in fields from Hampshire to the Rhineland. The American position in the summer of 1945 offers little comfort. Foreign Liquidation Commission teams propose that vehicles in good condition might cost Britain $400 each, those in fair condition $250, and even worn-out lorries $100. Multiplied across nearly 500,000 vehicles, the total is astronomical, a sum Britain, bankrupt after 6 years of total war, simply does not have. American automobile manufacturers, meanwhile, lobby quietly against any arrangement that would flood European markets with cheap surplus trucks and undercut their own post-war production lines. Through the summer, negotiations grind on while the vehicles themselves sit exposed to the weather, consuming guard labor and slowly deteriorating in their parks. Then, on 21 August 1945, the arithmetic changes entirely. President Truman terminates the Lend-Lease program abruptly, only days after Japan's surrender. Shipments already at sea continue to British ports, but the pipeline that had sustained Britain's war economy for 4 years simply closes. The shock forces both sides toward a settlement, and it arrives in December 1945 with the signing of the Anglo-American Financial Agreement. Rather than pricing each vehicle individually, the agreement folds the trucks into a single comprehensive settlement. Britain will pay $650 million for all retained Lend-Lease equipment, a figure representing roughly 10 cents on the dollar of the equipment's original value. In the House of Lords debate that December, Lord Pethick Lawrence relayed how American negotiators themselves characterized the terms, noting that they regarded the settlement as an exceedingly generous one from their own point of view, having written off the overwhelming majority of the original Lend-Lease debt entirely. With the financial framework in place, the physical sorting begins. And here the story shifts from the negotiating table in Washington to the mud of a British vehicle depot in the winter of 1945 to 1946. At regional processing centres established at Chilwell, Donington and Bicester, teams of mechanics and clerks work through the cold months inspecting, categorising and documenting vehicles one at a time. Of the nearly 500,000 trucks in the fleet, approximately 125,000 are judged essential for continued military service. Newer models, specialized variants or vehicles supporting the occupation forces in Germany. Another 95,000 transfer to civilian government use, the Ministry of Transport taking lorries for road maintenance, local authorities converting others for refuse collection and fire services. The remainder, roughly 185,000 vehicles, are marked uneconomical to retain and routed toward auction or the scrapyard. The friction of this process is not abstract. In Germany, where 78,000 American vehicles served the British Army of the Rhine, spare parts grow scarcer by the month as American military stocks run down, and the War Office is forced to retain only the newest GMC and Studebaker models while declaring older vehicles surplus, too costly to ship home. Instead, the Control Commission establishes disposal centres in Hamburg and Hanover, where German transport firms, desperate for any vehicle capable of moving freight through a shattered economy, purchase worn Chevrolets and Dodges for as little as $50 to $150 apiece. By late 1946, some 22,000 of these trucks, originally supplied to keep the British Army moving, are hauling freight on German roads under German number plates. Back in Britain, the steel shortage of 1946 turns the worst-conditioned vehicles into raw material. Scrap dealers buy worn-out trucks for as little as $15 to $30 each and cut them apart in yards across Birmingham, Sheffield and South Wales. By 1948, approximately 67,000 former Lend-Lease vehicles have been reduced to scrap metal feeding Britain's own reconstruction, an almost poetic closing of the loop. American steel shipped across the Atlantic to win a war, melted down to rebuild the country it had helped save. Not every vehicle finds so tidy an ending. In remote storage areas of Scotland and Northern Ireland, clusters of damaged and cannibalized trucks simply sit, too costly to move, too worthless to matter. The Ministry of Supply lacks the resources to clear them, and through the late 1940s, they gradually disappear beneath vegetation, becoming, in effect, small mechanical ruins scattered across the British countryside, the last physical trace of an arrangement that once determined the outcome of a continental war. The contrast with Britain's most significant wartime ally is stark. The Soviet Union, having received approximately 427,000 American trucks under its own Lend-Lease allocation, a fleet almost identical in size to Britain's, simply keeps nearly all of it. When American officials request accounting and the return of surplus equipment, Soviet authorities offer minimal cooperation. Studebaker trucks remain in Soviet military service into the 1960s. Britain, despite genuine financial desperation, honors the negotiated terms in full, a difference in conduct that becomes one of the earliest small fractures in the wartime alliance as it hardens into Cold War division. By 1949, the American vehicle fleet remaining in British military service has fallen to 73,000 units. The Korean War briefly extends the service life of some heavy lorries still in short supply. But by 1953, the number has dropped to roughly 28,000, mostly specialized types stationed in overseas garrisons where spare parts remain available. Civilian users, meanwhile, discover that the powerful American engines built for cheap wartime petrol consume far more fuel than British equivalents, a serious liability as rationing persists into the early 1950s, and most private operators quietly replace their surplus American trucks with domestic models by 1950. Preservation, when it comes at all, arrives almost by accident. The Imperial War Museum acquires a GMC CCKW lorry in 1967. The Tank Museum at Bovington preserves a Diamond T tank transporter. A Studebaker emerges from a Scottish forestry depot in 1982, still running after decades of hauling timber. Today, British military vehicle collections hold approximately 85 surviving examples of the American Lend-Lease fleet, a preservation rate representing a fraction of 1% of the nearly 500,000 vehicles that once crossed the Atlantic. Debriefing assessed as a logistics and policy problem rather than a combat operation, Britain's Lend-Lease truck settlement reveals 3 defining pressures and 1 lasting lesson. First, the abrupt termination of Lend-Lease on 21 August 1945 removed any possibility of a slow, orderly transition, forcing a financial settlement under acute time pressure rather than careful planning. Second, Britain's near-total economic exhaustion after 6 years of war made outright purchase impossible at American asking prices, and the eventual solution, a single bulk settlement at roughly 10% of original value, reflected political negotiation far more than the truck's actual condition or utility. Third, the fleet's disposal exposed the limits of even a successful logistics operation. Vehicles that had been indispensable to victory in North Africa and Northwest Europe became, within 3 years of the war's end, a net liability, consuming guard labor, spare parts and storage space faster than Britain could productively use them. The lasting lesson, drawn explicitly by British defence planners in the following decades, was one of dependency. The experience of negotiating retention terms for essential equipment while effectively bankrupt shaped a post-war preference for maintaining domestic production capacity, even at higher cost, specifically to avoid finding the country's transport and military capability once again subject to another nation's balance sheet.